Look at Earth from space at night, and most of the planet tells the same story, clusters of light bleeding into each other, city touching city, glow touching glow, all the way across a continent. Then look at the western edge of Australia. There's a single, brilliant cluster of light sitting completely alone. On one side, absolute darkness stretches for thousands of kilometers. On the other, the black expanse of the Indian Ocean, no neighboring glow, no nearby cluster. Just one city, burning bright in the middle of nothing. This is Perth, the most isolated capital city on Earth. Drive east from here and you'll cross over 2,000 kilometers of sun-scorched empty void before you see another major skyline. You'd actually reach Adelaide faster than you'd reach most towns halfway there, because for most of that drive, there's nothing at all. So here's the question worth sitting with. Why does a city this cut off from civilization have more self-made millionaires per capita than almost anywhere else on the planet? Why does a patch of sandy coastline thousands of miles from anywhere that matters glow that brightly? Stick around because the answer involves starving settlers, a genius engineer driven to suicide, driverless trains controlled from an office tower, and a gamble on desert minerals that changed the fate of an entire nation. To understand Perth, you have to understand that it's been shaped by two forces pulling in opposite directions for almost 200 years. The first is isolation. Brutal, unforgiving, geography-defying isolation. Nearly 4 million square kilometres of desert sits between Perth and Australia's eastern cities. That kind of separation doesn't just inconvenience a place that can starve it, cripple it, erase it from relevance entirely. And for the first several decades of Perth's existence, it very nearly did exactly that. The second force is almost the opposite of the first. Extraordinary geological luck. Beneath the sand and scrub of Western Australia sits some of the oldest, most mineral-dense crust on the entire planet, the Yilgarn Craton, the Pilbara, rock that formed billions of years ago, compressed into deposits of gold, iron, lithium, and nickel, so concentrated they would eventually make this remote outpost indispensable to the global economy. Isolation should have killed Perth. Geology made it too valuable to die, and the tension between those two forces cut off from everyone. Yet sitting on more mineral wealth than almost anywhere else is what actually built this city. That isolation, though, forged something else too, a fiercely self-reliant culture. Locals sometimes call it the island mentality, the psychological effect of knowing that if something goes wrong out here, help isn't a few hours away. It's a continent away. People in Perth learned early on that they'd have to solve their own problems because nobody was coming to solve them first. But before any of that wealth arrived, before any of that confidence took hold, Perth had to survive being one of the worst land settlements in the history of the British Empire. In 1829, a British naval officer named James Stirling sailed up a river on Australia's western coast and decided this was the place to build a colony. He'd surveyed the area briefly a couple of years earlier, seen green banks and fertile-looking soil, and convinced himself and the British government that this spot along the Swan River would become a thriving agricultural settlement. He was wrong. Almost catastrophically wrong. The soil around the Swan River wasn't fertile at all. It was sandy, nutrient-poor, and practically useless for the kind of farming European settlers knew how to do. The wind never seemed to stop. And worse than the soil, worse than the wind, was the isolation itself. This colony had no reliable connection to any major trade route on Earth. Ships had to make a deliberate, costly detour just to reach it, and plenty of captains decided it simply wasn't worth the trip. Within a few years, the settlers were in genuine trouble. Imagine packing up your entire life in England furniture, heirlooms, a grand piano that had belonged to your family for generations, shipping it across 2 oceans on the promise of a new life, and then finding yourself so desperate for basic food that you'd trade that piano for a few sacks of flour. That wasn't exaggeration. That was documented reality. Settlers swapped genuinely precious possessions for the most basic staples because starvation doesn't care about sentimental value. The colony earned a bitter nickname during this period. Some called it Sleepy Hollow, others simply a place of exile, a phrase that told you everything about how the rest of the world viewed it. Not a frontier of opportunity, a dead end. By 1850, the free settlers of the Swan River Colony made a decision that tells you exactly how desperate things had become. They petitioned the British government to send them convicts. Not because they wanted criminals in their community, but because they needed labor cheap, forced labor to build the most basic infrastructure a functioning settlement requires. Roads, jetties, public buildings made of something sturdier than mud and hope. A colony founded specifically as a free settlement, built by people who'd wanted nothing to do with Australia's convict system, was now begging for prisoners just to survive. For 40 years, Perth was a failed experiment, clinging to the edge of a continent that didn't seem to want it. Then, out in the scorching desert interior, somebody found yellow metal in the dirt, and everything changed. Gold has a way of making people do reckless things, and the 1890s gold rushes at Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie brought tens of thousands of prospectors pouring into one of the driest, most punishing landscapes in Australia. Word spread fast. There was gold in that red dirt, real gold, enough to make ordinary people wealthy overnight. So they came, by the thousands, on foot, by camel, by whatever transport they could scrape together, chasing a fortune buried in the sand. There was just one enormous problem nobody had properly accounted for. There was almost no water out there. None. Think about that for a second. These fields were producing some of the richest gold deposits on the planet, and yet a bottle of drinking water in Kalgoorlie could cost more than the gold a miner had just pulled out of the ground. Men were literally striking a rich and then dying of thirst within walking distance of their own claim. Disease spread through contaminated water supplies. Desperation set in fast. A humanitarian crisis was unfolding in the middle of an economic miracle. Solving this problem fell to an engineer named C.Y. O'Connor, and the solution he proposed sounded, to most people at the time, completely insane. O'Connor wanted to pump millions of gallons of fresh water every single day, from a reservoir near Perth, uphill, across 560 kilometres of scorching desert through a steel pipeline, all the way to Kalgoorlie. In 1896, with no digital pumping networks, no computer modelling, no modern materials, science, just steam-powered pumping stations based along an unforgiving route, this was one of the most audacious engineering proposals anyone in the British Empire had ever attempted. The public reaction wasn't admiration, it was ridicule. Newspapers mocked the plan relentlessly. Critics called it a fantasy, an impossible waste of public money, the delusion of an engineer who'd overreached far beyond what was achievable. O'Connor endured years of this public humiliation, accusations of corruption, relentless character attacks in the press while he pushed the project forward anyway, convinced it would work. And here's where this story turns from engineering triumph into genuine tragedy. In March of 1902, worn down by years of sustained media harassment and public disgrace, C.Y. O'Connor rode his horse into the ocean near Fremantle and took his own life. He never got to see the outcome of his life's work. Less than a year lacked some of his life's work. Less than a year later, in January of 1903, water reached Kalgoorlie. The pipeline worked exactly as O'Connor had designed it. It became one of the great engineering achievements of the era, proof that human ambition could physically force water across a landscape that had never intended to give any up. Perth had just proven something crucial about itself. It could engineer its way out of environmental death. That confidence, that willingness to attempt the impossible, was about to matter far more than anyone in 1903 could have predicted, because half a century later, a second geological discovery buried beneath the desert would turn this struggling colony into a global economic titan. For decades, Australia sat on a federal export ban that prohibited iron ore from leaving the country, based on outdated fears about depleting a limited resource. In 1960, that ban was lifted. And what got unlocked wasn't a limited resource at all. It was mountains, literal mountains of some of the highest grade iron ore deposits found anywhere on the planet, sitting in a remote region of northern Western Australia called the Pilbara. A prospector named Lang Hancock is often credited with recognizing the scale of what was up there, reportedly spotting the telltale red rock formations of hematite ore while flying over the region during a storm. Whatever the exact details of that discovery, what followed was unmistakable. Western Australia's north became a mega quarry feeding two of the fastest industrializing economies on Earth. First Japan, and decades later, China, both desperate for the raw steel-making material. This desert kept producing in staggering quantities. But here's what made this different from a typical mining boom. Extracting that iron ore required an entirely new layer of infrastructure that didn't exist yet, and Western Australia had to build all of it from scratch. Private companies constructed their own heavy-haul railways, some of the longest privately owned rail networks on Earth, cutting straight through the desert to move ore from the mines to the coast. Saltwater ports had to be built to handle ships large enough to carry that ore across oceans, and Port Hedland transformed from a sleepy coastal outpost into one of the highest tonnage ports in the world. And where did the money, the management, the corporate headquarters end up? Not out in the Pilbara itself. That remote, brutal terrain was for extraction, not for living. The wealth flowed straight back to Perth. St. George Terrace, the city's main financial artery, filled with glass towers housing the corporate nerve centres of mining giants, turning a once isolated outpost into the operational command post for machinery, personnel and logistics happening 1,000 kilometres away. Think about what that actually means. Perth became the city where decisions got made about equipment the size of apartment buildings, operating in the deep desert, decisions made by executives sitting in air-conditioned offices, thousands of kilometres from the dust and heat their companies were profiting from. By the 2000s, Perth wasn't just shipping raw rock out to the world anymore. It invented an entirely new way of working, one that would redefine what remote labour even meant and completely reshape the identity of the city itself. Here's a phrase that's practically synonymous with modern Perth: FIFO. Fly in, fly out. Instead of building towns near remote mine sites, towns that would need schools, hospitals and grocery stores in the middle of nowhere, the mining industry found a different solution. Fly the workers in. House them in temporary camps near the mine. Work them intensely for 1 to 3 weeks straight. Then fly them home, back to Perth, for an equally intense stretch of time off. Every single day, Perth Airport processes an army of these workers, engineers, machine operators, geologists, cooks, electricians commuting not across a city but across a continent to work sites hundreds or even thousands of kilometres into the desert interior. The economic effect on Perth itself was staggering. FIFO wages, particularly during boom years, were extraordinary entry-level positions on some sites, paying more than university-educated professionals earned in most Australian cities. That money flowed straight into Perth's economy, inflating real estate prices, fueling a genuine jet-set lifestyle for some residents, and creating one of the wealthiest per capita populations in the country. But it wasn't free money, psychologically speaking. Spending weeks at a time isolated in a remote desert camp, disconnected from family, cycling between intense overwork and empty downtime took a documented toll on mental health across the FIFO workforce. Perth's prosperity has always come with this quieter, more human cost embedded inside wealth, built on top of loneliness, distance stacked on top of distance. And then the technology took an even stranger turn. Perth became a genuine world leader in autonomous mining operations. Massive haul trucks, the kind that dwarf a 2-story house, now drive themselves across Pilbara mine sites without a human inside the cab at all. Freight trains stretching over a kilometre-long run without an onboard driver, controlled instead from operations centres sitting inside glass office towers in downtown Perth, over 1,000 kilometres away. Picture that for a moment. A worker sits at a desk in an air-conditioned high-rise in the city, watching multiple screens, and with a few inputs, guides a multi-ton train through the desert in real time, as if the distance simply didn't exist anymore. Perth didn't just survive its isolation. It built the technology to operate right through it. But as the city grew richer, more automated, more impressive by every measure, its oldest enemy quietly came back. Not a lack of capital this time, a lack of water. Perth's climate has been shifting, and not in the city's favour. Rainfall across the region has dropped by roughly 20% since the 1970s, a slow but relentless decline that's rendered many of the traditional dam-fed reservoirs the city once depended on almost obsolete. The rain simply isn't refilling them the way it used to. This is the same city, remember, that once solved a water crisis by forcing a pipeline 560 kilometres across the desert. So how do you solve the shortage like this a century later? You turn to the ocean. Perth built large-scale seawater desalination plants, industrial facilities capable of stripping salt out of ocean water at a scale sufficient to supply nearly half of the city's entire drinking water needs. Combined with groundwater replenishment schemes effectively recycling treated water back into aquifers deep underground, Perth engineered an entirely new water supply chain almost from scratch because the old one could no longer be trusted to hold. At the same time, the resource economy that built this city has been quietly shifting beneath its feet. Iron ore made Perth wealthy for half a century, but the global economy is changing what it needs. Lithium, essential for electric vehicle batteries. Nickel, critical for battery chemistry and stainless steel. Liquefied natural gas, feeding energy demand across Asia. Western Australia sits on massive deposits of all three, and Perth is positioning itself once again as the operational headquarters for whatever the next resource boom turns out to be. Can technology keep shielding a city built on the edge of an increasingly dry continent forever? Nobody knows for certain. But if Perth's history has proven anything, it's that this city doesn't wait for nature to cooperate. It builds around nature instead. For all its wealth, all its engineering triumphs, all its technological reinvention, Perth carries a vulnerability that's easy to overlook when you're staring at glass towers and desalination plants. It depends enormously on a small handful of trading partners, particularly China, to keep buying what it digs out of the ground. That kind of economic concentration is a genuine risk. Global trade tensions, shifting geopolitics, a single major buyer deciding to change course. Any of these could send tremors through an economy this dependent on resource exports. The same isolation that once nearly starved this city could, in a different form, threaten it again. Not physical isolation this time, but economic isolation if the world's appetite for what Western Australia produces ever shifts. And running a high-tech, automated, desalinated, air-conditioned metropolis on the edge of one of the most remote regions on Earth isn't cheap. Every piece of infrastructure that keeps this city functioning costs more to build and maintain out here than it would almost anywhere else, simply because everything materials, expertise, equipment has to travel further to arrive. And yet, ask people who actually live in Perth how they feel about that isolation, and you'll often hear something surprising. They don't talk about it like a curse. They talk about it like a shield. A kind of protective moat that's kept the city a little slower, a little safer, a little more self-contained than the crowded capitals on the other side of the country. The same distance that nearly killed this place in 1830 is, for a lot of Perth residents today, exactly why they choose to stay. So which is it? Is Perth's extreme distance from everywhere its ultimate defense mechanism, or its most dangerous long-term vulnerability? Maybe the honest answer is that it's always being both at once. Go back to that satellite image one more time. That single cluster of light burning alone against the dark curve of the planet, hemmed in by empty desert on one side and empty ocean on the other. Perth doesn't exist because geography made it easy. Geography, by every reasonable measure, said this place should have failed. Bad soil, no water, no trade routes. No neighbours for thousands of kilometres in any direction. And for the colony's first 4 decades, geography very nearly won. What changed the outcome wasn't luck alone, even though the gold and the iron and the lithium buried in that ancient crust certainly helped. What changed the outcome was a refusal to accept the limits that isolation seemed to impose. Engineers forcing water uphill across 560 kilometres of desert, companies building railways and ports where none had existed, a city inventing entirely new ways to operate machinery 1,000 kilometres from where anyone sat. Perth exists not because geography allows it. It exists because human ingenuity refused to let the desert claim it. Is that isolation Perth's greatest asset or its most dangerous long-term vulnerability? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below.